been a while since I did this Points of Prophecy thing. So, but I think I stopped in the middle of a little bit of a presentation on Israel. And if you want, turn your Bibles to Zechariah chapter, maybe last couple verses of 13 and chapter 14. Zechariah is next to the last book before you get into the New Testament, if that helps any. At that point there, last week was talking about Israel, God's chosen people, and the question, I'd asked, or sometimes I even wonder, what's so important about Israel? They wasn't the first nationality of people on this earth, just what makes them so special, and that's kind of one thing what we want to look at this evening. Of course, we know that God Himself, no man has ever saw Him, so if He was somewhere today, probably we wouldn't know, would we? Because we never saw God. We know He's light. We know that He's love. We know that He's Spirit. And of course, we also know that His Son, Jesus Christ, came into this world as a man, so we get to know Him. We also know that this book right here, when we talk about Israel, primarily came from that area of people, all except maybe one author, the whole book. So we know that God is the creator of all things, and we can get a true picture of just who God is by looking at His creation. I think sometimes when I grew up, I was out in the country more. You look up into the skies, the heavens, and the awesomeness of the stars and lights and distance, and that's just what you can see, I don't know if we ever do that much today. There's so much noise, so much lights in most areas that we're involved with. Then a lot of times maybe we just forget to look up, don't we? But at any rate, God has did an awful lot, and that's why He chose Israel, so that it could be a blessing to not only us, but we would understand and know who He is and what we should be doing and what He expects out of us. So Israel is our example, and when they did something great, He blessed them, He led them. When there's disobedient, there's chastisement, and there's a lot of that with Israel. So we also get a picture of what happens when we're not obedient. So this is just a touch of the screen, so to speak, to tell you, who Israel is. And just a couple of notes I made here. God set Israel apart for the purpose of demonstrating His glory to the world. This selection of Israel as God's special possession was not meant for Israel's own benefit, but that through Israel the world would be blessed, all of us, through these people. Israel was to tell and show the world who God was and is. She was to tell the world that it is the Lord and not false prophets or pagan idols who created this universe. And you can see how important some of these statements are, because the majority of the people in this world is worshiping pagans, sometimes self-humanism, with bunches of idols. Even the little Bible scholar from Marietta here Sunday give you just a little bit of a picture of Japan. And he said the Philippines are full of idols, false gods. We have them right here too. Sometimes anything we put ahead of God is an idol, So it could be almost anything. Israel did fail to obey God, and they reaped the consequences. Now, I could have put several notes in there, but the major one was probably when Judah, of course, was disobedient, and Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, took them into Babylon for 70 years for chastisement, for disobedience. The northern kingdom, Israel, Syria, took them into captivity. They're spreading across the world. And even just a few years later, in AD 70, the whole nation of Israel was dispersed to the four corners of the world. And this happened in AD 70, lasted at least 1,300 years. And during this period, this is where a lot of things crept into our theology and churches, and some of it, we covered this the last time, some of it was the very theology that came up with the church replaced Israel and for all the blessings, and this is still rampant in a lot of churches today, and especially when you can talk about Catholics and even a lot of Protestants through the covenant. What was I trying to say? We was talking about this coming up. And even the churches that is strayed so far from doctrine, but we hardly recognize them as a live church today. So this is just some of the areas that we've talked about with Israel, and this is about the point we was when I left off. And it kind of brings us, we was in the regathering part of this, I think is where we left off. And of course, we mentioned the sovereignty of God, the going out and moving things that needs to go in place to bring things together, the providence of God. And some of them was, we mentioned, a major one was World War II, when there was 6 million Jews of the Holocaust killed, murdered in Germany, primarily in Poland, under the German armies. And this created a lot of sympathy for the Jews, a lot of sadness to bring these people maybe back. It worked in the hearts and lives of people like Harry Truman, that stuck his head out and said to the United Nations, it is today. But at that point, he wanted a resolution to give them a homeland. And there was one passed, had it not been for this, against almost everyone's will, it would never came about. So, and I remember reading the story somewhere, and I hate to quote this because it's been so many years ago, but Harry Truman's mother one time told him when he was starting into politics that if he ever had an opportunity to help Israel, make sure he did it. And this was, one of the times that, God installs it maybe in your heart. This is what needs to do if this ever comes about. So this is the way God works in a lot of areas, even of our lives today, through people.
Did you ever stop to think, I think about this quite often. Israel today won't even let our missionaries in really like the time, if I understand. And it's hard to understand why, we're to back somebody who don't believe in Christ. But they believe in God.
Yes.
So it's really difficult.
Yeah, well, this is part of this, and we may probably not even get into it tonight, but the kind of answer to the question is, we know, and even Paul talks about their eyes are being covered. They don't see, they don't understand. Now, it wasn't but God did that. Because of their blindness, then God set them apart. And of course that brought the Gentiles in. And again fulfills the covenant of Abraham, which says through your seed the whole world's going to be blessed. And there is a time, and if we get far enough, and if I don't, we'll do it the next time, eventually these eyes are going to be opened, and the people, the Jews that's left, is going to come to Christ. And, weep for the one that they pierced. And so there is a bright day ahead. There's a lot of anxiety that's between us, the time we're living, and that happening. And the same thing's true for the Gentiles. And I'd like to get into that a little bit as we go through this period. But, anytime you have a question, and maybe that just partially, answers it, but we can even look at it more as we go through this series that I kind of pinned out. Before we go any farther, let me read us some scriptures and here in Zechariah, and if you found your place, and this really is a summation of starting at about where we're at today, which we have Israel back in a land, not near the land they should have. But this will maybe give us a little picture, even these scriptures here, to help clear even that up, and then we'll explain it some as we have the opportunity and time. Okay, and if you have your place there in Zechariah, I was going to read a couple verses in chapter 13. And we had a missionary here not very long ago, but did a whole sermon on verse 7, I think it was, chapter 13 of Zechariah. And I can't remember the guy's name, but he did a fantastic job, I thought. He answered a lot of questions. So I'll just refer there to 7 before we go to 8, but it was, awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man that is my fellow, saith the Lord of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn mine hand upon the little ones. And he did a fantastic job of, who killed Jesus. This is God speaking, and he's telling the sword, awake, we're going to slay my son. And actually that verse within itself covers the first and second coming. Because Jesus even quoted from it, when he was here on earth, that when you smite the shepherd, the sheep's going to be scattered. And of course that happened at his crucifixion, when he was smitten, and all the disciples at that point, left him. So this is, anyway, just mentioning we're going, now the rest of this is going to be second coming. That particular verse covers both of them. Okay, verse 8, and it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith the Lord, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. And this is kind of an answer a little bit, or going into what you brought up, Sam, is the fact that 2/3 of them, of the Jews, is going to be killed. That's a bigger percentage than it was during World War II. I think it was 6 million Jews slaughtered during II under Hitler, out of, I think it was like 15 million Jews in the world at that point. I mean, they have been, because of their disobedience, they've been chastised severely over the years, and you can see the result. Right now, they're less than 1% of the world population, maybe less than 0.5%. Okay, anyway, then in verse 9, and I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and try them as gold is tried. They shall call my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God. So the other third is going to be refined, and this is going to be a period of time most people, and I've spent a little bit of time dividing up the 70th week of Daniel as we went through some of these prophecies. And as we get into the middle of that, 3.5 years into that 70th week, or 7 years, it is not really weeks, but it is years. It's the way they wrote it when Daniel wrote it. But in the middle of that, the Antichrist is going to be in full power here on earth, and he's going to, most people feel, going to bring in the millennium because they think he's Christ, including the Jews. So this is a severe period, and immediately he sets himself up to be, worshipped, and instead of bringing in the millennium, he brings on the Great Tribulation. And this is where 2/3 of the Jews is going to be killed. And God's going to protect a good remnant of them. And you can read that in chapter 7 of Revelations, where he sealed 144,000 for his first fruits of the Jews. And this is some of the protection of coming through that great tribulation. Okay, now as we, and the other, verse 3, then will actually be chastised and have to go through the day of the Lord. And this scripture here will kind of fill that in for us as we go.
Do you think at that time, when 2/3 is destroyed, that we in the country will be fighting with Israel?
We'll be fighting Israel.
Fighting with them, that never, we'll never turn our back on them.
Yeah. Now, as we get into this, it says all nations is going to come against Jerusalem. Now, there's, nowhere in Scripture that tells us real plain where the United States of America is. But this is one, and as we read the rest of the Scripture, we can probably point that out as we go to it. So, all nations, and we see, or I see, some weakening of our support of Israel even now. And as oil and this Muslim movement, what the Far East Spring are calling it, with all these nations coming and doing away with a dictator. But if you notice, they're putting in probably will end up with Sharia law under the Muslims. And so you can just see this all coming together. And this is going to be a group of nations that's also going to come against Jerusalem. And that's Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. And God has to intervene again to save it. And this is why I say there's a lot of hardship coming yet for the Jews. In other words, they haven't seen nothing yet from what we've already. And this, to a large degree, can also apply to the Gentiles as we look, when we see what God does to the nations that all come against Israel. And some of this, and this is kind of an overview, does a good job of filling in some of the details here in Ezekiel, but you've got to kind of look at the Revelations and Jeremiah and Ezekiel to get the full picture of it. But that as we learn a little bit at a time, I will, be more prepared for what's ahead of everyone from the day we live in. And that's what I think most of us want. I kind of like to even get the weather report for tomorrow. And I probably ain't going to do nothing, but I just wonder if it's going to snow or rain or get down to zero. I'm curious. I always like to know, and naturally our life is the same way, so that we can learn our enemies and know what's a-coming, and we can look to God for our direction and support. That's really what it's all about. The only safe haven is in Jesus Christ as we get into the very end times of this era that we're living in. Okay, let's look at chapter 14, and we'll try to get through this. Anyway, the scriptures. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all the nations. See what I'm saying, Sam? Against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, the houses rift, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity. Half of the Jews right there is going to be taken into captivity. The residue of the people shall not be cut off from this city. In other words, half of the people in the city's still going to be in there moving in and out. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. Now, this is right at the end of the age. We're incorporating, and Zechariah kind of, like he did there in the verse we started out with, he'll place some things. It's not 100% chronological as you read it, but this part is in the very last of the end of the age. And verse 3, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against them, I think I read, nations, as he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. If you recall, even there in the old temple wall, right now the east gate is locked. They don't want anybody going in and out of it, because this is reserved for Jesus Christ when he comes. He's going to come from the east through, and I don't think it'll be that gate, because there's going to be another temple rebuilt. But it will be the eastern gate. He comes from the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley. Now, this is, like I say, at the very end of the age. If you go to Jerusalem today, there is no great valley right around the temple or Jerusalem. But as these scriptures explain, there's going to be a lot of change when he sets his foot on the Mount of Olives. And half of the mountain shall be removed from the north, and half of it toward the south. And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach into Azel. Ye shall flee, like as ye fled from the 40 earthquake in the days of Asa the king, which was a pretty major earthquake, but nothing like we're going to see of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. Now, I would like to make one mention there that under interpretation, saints probably isn't the best statement there. It's normally holy ones is what, and that's what even most of the Bibles transferred in the same word in other areas. So holy ones usually means, when in the Bible, it's referring to angels. as his valiant warriors. And it shall come to pass in that day, and what do we call that day? And it's going to be repeated here a lot of times, is nothing more than the day of the Lord. And if you break that 7 years up, Jesus called the first half of his beginning of sorrow. Then the middle starts a great tribulation, which is cut short in Matthew 24. God cuts it short and enters into the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the day of God's wrath and severe judgment on the things that needs to be cleansed, because he can't take sin. And it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall be not be clear nor dark. And like I say, this is in most places, if you go into Joel, when you look at the day of the Lord, it's a day of darkness. It's a day of terrible judgment. Even in Matthew 24, that's the first thing Jesus mentions as he goes into the day of the Lord. The moon will, or the sun will refuse to give its light. The moon will turn dark. And this is the day of the Lord, his coming. So, in Revelations, the people that's fighting God sees this, and they're going to flee to the mountains to hide in the rocks from him that sits on the face of the earth, coming to earth. But it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. And so the day is going to clear up by the time we get through it. But when he comes, the whole creation is going to be in complete disruption. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. The former sea is what we call the Dead Sea over there. Nothing grows in it. It's got a lot of good minerals, but that's this flowing of living water is going to flow right through the Dead Sea and even into the toward the Hinder Sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea. And so Jerusalem right now is not a seaport. If you see pictures, and I haven't been over there, but it's a mountainous terrain, and this thing's going to be split the Mount of Olives, and we're going to have some kind of a major spring or a water flow that's going to clear out the Dead Sea and flow from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea right through Jerusalem. So it will be a seaport city when God brings this about. And in summer, let's see, where was I at? In the former and half of them toward the Hinder Sea, in summer and in winter it shall be. So it's going to be the same all the way through. Don't you guys let me get too far past letting the kids, ride home. So. Okay, verse 9. And the Lord shall be king over the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. All the land shall be turned as a plain from Gibeah to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, and it shall be lifted up and inhabited in her place. From Benjamin's gate, and to the place of the first gate, to the corner gate, and from the corner of Hanel, and to the king's wine press. And men shall dwell in it, and there shall be more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. This will be the first time in history since the formation of Jerusalem that there's going to be peace in Jerusalem. So it is coming. And we didn't get into it in a great detail, but where I left off there in my study guide thing was the fact that in 1948, March of 13, when Israel became a nation, the very next day, it was attacked by 3 Muslim countries. Israel didn't even have an army, so to speak. I think they had 1 tank, you know, and they withstood. It was 5 major wars there in about 30 years, continuous in Israel. And one of them was in their most holy day, when they was celebrating Hanukkah in their temples and in the temple and synagogues, and or not the temple, the synagogues, celebrating, Hanukkah, which is the time that Jerusalem had enough oil to withstand the light for 7 days when they really had enough for one. So they celebrate that. It's kind of during that 400 silent years that God didn't speak, but he was speaking to the Jewish people. And it was that time. This is the one they were celebrating. So they're all in there when the attacks came. And I saw movies from a few people went over there trying to pick up miracles, and just beyond reason, some of the things that happened. I remember one scene I looked at where in the desert they had all these landmines, and they was out there for bayonets trying to determine where the landmines was so they could bring their tanks in. And of course that was going to take forever. And all at once this tremendous wind came up and blew that desert sand completely out and left all the landmines exposed. So all they had to do is just, pick them up and put them out of commission and bring their tanks in. Now, most people that is not that close to God thinks it's just a coincidence. Just happened to be a great big wind that done that. But there was so many things like that, and of course what the thing turned out to be, even with all these wars, one statement would sum it up. Against all odds, Israel survived. So that just gives us a little picture of how God is moving and bringing, and the reason he's doing it is all the scriptures had to be fulfilled that he was going to bring Israel back to their homeland. And after 1900 years, no nation had ever been dispersed for that long and never came back as a nation, much less the Hebrew language, which they was all speaking different languages, except Israel. They're the only nation in the world. Who's going to, again, it's just a coincidence that God brings, and they're not all bad kids. I'm not saying that. There's better than 6 million Jews in Israel. About 1.5 million Palestinians, I think, lives in their country under democracy. But we got probably 6 million in New York Jews yet, and there's roughly, I think, 18 million worldwide. And the reason there's so few, so many times they've almost been wiped clear out, like it was in World War II. We're getting awfully close, and we'll finish maybe reading this a little bit and get into the study a little bit. I probably brought up more questions than I gave you answers. I don't know, But it's a fascinating study, and I do want to mention, well, let me just, before we leave this part, because I did mention it ain't going to be good for Gentiles either. If you look at verse 16, there in Zechariah 14, and it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations, the people that's left out of all them nations which came against Jerusalem, shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of the tabernacles. There's still going to be nations in this millennial kingdom. And these are the ones, the few Gentiles from every nation that committed themselves to God during that period. And so, most of them, if we go back and when we pick up the other scriptures, it is real devastation for the Gentiles. They're, in a wine press, and it's described in Revelations, and the blood flowed not height of a horse's bridle, and a tremendous destruction. Some Jews or Gentiles is going to come through this, refine, and go into the millennium and worship the King in Jerusalem in the Feast of Tabernacles. The only feast that really applies. All the other feasts that the Jews are doing this day has been fulfilled by Jesus Christ when His first comes. So that's the reason it mentions the Feast of Tabernacles. Is there any other questions, and we'll get into this the next time I do it, which is, I don't know, Jim, he'll probably be back for next Wednesday, but he might not. If he isn't, I'll be here and we'll get a little more of what's in the future for us and a little more of the timing as to when it's going to happen. Not in days. I don't know the day, only God knows. But in the timetable of other events, and then we have more things to look at, so we'll know what's a coming next. Well, we better go because the kids won't come back next Wednesday. Father, thank you for loving us and just giving us your word and placing us here on this earth, and went to all extremes to get us to understand just who you are and who created this universe and just what's going to happen even in our future. And we can apply this to what happened in the past. And we know each statement of your prophecy that was made has been fulfilled in completeness in every detail. So there's no reason to doubt if we just study your word and learn and grow in you. And again, we just lift up all those that's on our prayer concerns, others for surgery and for becoming or getting over the devastation that has happened even this day with Darlene. Restore and use the doctors and medications to bring us to another time if it be your will around your altar here, Faith Baptist Church. So just guide us through this evening and help us to be faithful. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Thanks.